Herbert Spencer was an English philosopher, biologist, anthropologist, sociologist, and prominent classical liberal political theorist of the Victorian era. Spencer developed an all-embracing conception of evolution as the progressive development of the physical world, biological organisms, the human mind, and human culture and societies. He was an enthusiastic exponent of evolution, and even wrote about evolution before Darwin did. As a polymath, he contributed to a wide range of subjects, including ethics, religion, anthropology, economics, political theory, philosophy, literature, astronomy, biology, sociology, and psychology. During his lifetime he achieved tremendous authority, mainly in English-speaking academia. The only other English philosopher to have achieved anything like such widespread popularity was Bertrand Russell, and that was in the 20th century. Spencer was the single most famous European intellectual in the closing decades of the 19th century, but his influence declined sharply. After 1900, who now reads Spencer? Asked Talcott Parsons in 1937. Spencer is best known for the expression, survival of the fittest, which he coined in Principles of Biology, after reading Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. This term strongly suggests natural selection, yet as Spencer extended evolution into realms of sociology and ethics, he also made use of Lamarckism. Life. Spencer was born in Derby, England, on the 27th of April 1820, the son of William George Spencer. Spencer's father was a religious dissenter who drifted from Methodism to Quakerism, and who seems to have transmitted to his son an opposition to all forms of authority. He ran a school founded on the progressive teaching methods of Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi and also served as secretary of the Derby Philosophical Society, a scientific society which had been founded in the 1790s by Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin. Spencer was educated in empirical science by his father, while the members of the Derby Philosophical Society introduced him to pre-Darwinian concepts of biological evolution, particularly those of Erasmus Darwin and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. His uncle, the Reverend Thomas Spencer, vicar of Hinton Charterhouse near Bath, completed Spencer's limited formal education by teaching him some mathematics and physics, and enough Latin to enable him to translate some easy texts. Thomas Spencer also imprinted on his nephew his own firm free trade and anti-statist political views. Otherwise, Spencer was an autodidact who acquired most of his knowledge from narrowly focused readings and conversations with his friends and acquaintances. As both an adolescent and a young man, Spencer found it difficult to settle to any intellectual or professional discipline. He worked as a civil engineer during the railway boom of the late 1830s, while also devoting much of his time to writing for provincial journals that were non-conformist in the religion and radical in the politics. From 1848 to 1853, he served as sub-editor on the free trade journal The Economist, during which time he published his first book, Social Statics, which predicted that humanity would eventually become completely adapted to the requirements of living in society with the consequential withering away of the state. Its publisher, John Chapman, introduced Spencer to his salon, which was attended by many of the leading radical and progressive thinkers of the capital, including John Stuart Mill, Harriet Martineau, George Henry Lewis and Mary Ann Evans, with whom he was briefly romantically linked. Spencer himself introduced the biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, who would later win fame as Darwin's bulldog, and who remained his lifelong friend. However, it was the friendship of Evans and Lewis that acquainted him with John Stuart Mill's A System of Logic and with Auguste Comte's positivism, and which set him on the road to his life's work. he strongly disagreed with Comte. The first fruit of his friendship with Evans and Lewis was Spencer's second book, Principles of Psychology, published in 1855, which explored a physiological basis for psychology. The book was founded on the fundamental assumption that the human mind was subject to natural laws and that these could be discovered within the framework of general biology. This permitted the adoption of a developmental perspective not merely in terms of the individual, but also of the species and the race. Through this paradigm, Spencer aimed to reconcile the associationist psychology of Mill's logic, the notion that human mind was constructed from atomic sensations held together by the laws of the association of ideas, with the apparently more scientific theory of phrenology, which located specific mental functions in specific parts of the brain. Spencer argued that both these theories were partial accounts of the truth. Repeated associations of ideas were embodied in the formation of specific strands of brain tissue, and these could be passed from one generation to the next by means of the Lamarckian mechanism of use inheritance. The psychology, he believed, would do for the human mind what Isaac Newton had done for matter. However, the book was not initially successful, and the last of the 251 copies of its first edition was not sold until June 1861. Spencer's interest in psychology derived from a more fundamental concern, which was to establish the universality of natural law. In common with others of his generation, including the members of Chapman's Salon, he was possessed with the idea of demonstrating that it was possible to show that everything in the universe, including human culture, language, and morality, could be explained by laws of universal validity. This was in contrast to the views of many theologians of the time who insisted that some parts of creation, in particular the human soul, were beyond the realm of scientific investigation. Comte's Système de philosophie positive had been written with the ambition of demonstrating the universality of natural law, and Spencer was to follow Comte in the scale of his ambition. However, Spencer differed from Comte in believing it was possible to discover a single law of universal application which he identified with progressive development and was to call the principle of evolution. In 1858, Spencer produced an outline of what was to become the system of synthetic philosophy. This immense undertaking, which has few parallels in the English language, aimed to demonstrate that the principle of evolution applied in biology, psychology, sociology and morality. Spencer envisaged that this work of 10 volumes would take 20 years to complete. In the end, it took him twice as long and consumed almost all the rest of his long life. Despite Spencer's early struggles to establish himself as a writer, by the 1870s he had become the most famous philosopher of the age. His works were widely read during his lifetime, and by 1869 he was able to support himself solely on the profit of book sales and on income from his regular contributions to Victorian periodicals, which were collected as 3 volumes of essays. His works were translated into German, Italian, Spanish, French, Russian, Japanese and Chinese, and into many other languages, and he was offered honors and awards all over Europe and North America. He also became a member of the Athenaeum, an exclusive gentlemen's club in London open only to those distinguished in the arts and sciences, and the X Club, a dining club of 9 founded by T.H. Huxley that met every month and included some of the most prominent thinkers of the Victorian age. Members included physicist-philosopher John Tyndall and Darwin's cousin, the banker and biologist Sir John Lubbock. There were also some quite significant satellites such as liberal clergyman Arthur Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, and guests such as Charles Darwin and Herman van Helmholtz were entertained from time to time. Through such such associations. Spencer had a strong presence in the heart of the scientific community and was able to secure an influential audience for his views. Despite his growing wealth and fame, he never owned a house of his own. The last decades of Spencer's life were characterized by growing disillusionment and loneliness. He never married, and after 1855 was a perpetual hypochondriac who complained endlessly of pains and maladies that no physician could diagnose. By the 1890s his readership had begun to desert him while many of his closest friends died, and he had come to doubt the confident faith in progress that he had made the centerpiece of his philosophical system. His later years were also ones in which his political views became increasingly conservative, whereas social statics had been the work of a radical Democrat who believed in votes for women and in the nationalization of the land to break the power of the aristocracy. By the 1880s he had become a staunch opponent of female suffrage and made common cause with the landowners of the Liberty and Property Defense League against what they saw as the drift towards socialism of elements within the administration of William Ewart Gladstone, largely against the opinions of Gladstone himself. Spencer's political views from this period were expressed in what has become his most famous work, The Man versus the State. The exception to Spencer's growing conservatism was that he remained throughout his life an ardent opponent of imperialism and militarism. His critique of the Boer War was especially scathing, and it contributed to his declining popularity in Britain. Spencer also invented a precursor to the modern paperclip, though it looked more like a modern cotter pin. This binding pin was distributed by Ackerman and Amp Company. Spencer shows drawings of the pin in Appendix I of his autobiography along with published descriptions of its uses. In 1902, shortly before his death, Spencer was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature. He continued writing all his life, in later years often by dictation, until he succumbed to poor health at the age of 83. His ashes are interred in the eastern side of London's Highgate Cemetery facing Karl Marx's grave. At Spencer's funeral, the Indian nationalist leader Shyamji Krishnavarma announced a donation of £1,000 to establish a lectureship at Oxford University in tribute to Spencer and his work. Synthetic philosophy. The basis for Spencer's appeal to many of his generation was that he appeared to offer a ready-made system of belief which could substitute for conventional religious faith at a time when orthodox creeds were crumbling under the advances of modern science. Spencer's philosophical system seemed to demonstrate that it was possible to believe in the ultimate perfection of humanity on the basis of advanced scientific conceptions such as the first law of thermodynamics and biological evolution. In essence, Spencer's philosophical vision was formed by a combination of deism and positivism. On the one hand, he had imbibed something of 18th-century deism from his father and other members of the Derby Philosophical Society, and from books like George Combs' immensely popular The Constitution of Man. This treated the world as a cosmos of benevolent design, and the laws of nature as the decrees of a being transcendently kind. Natural laws were thus the statutes of a well-governed universe that had been decreed by the Creator with the intention of promoting human happiness. Although Spencer lost his Christian faith as a teenager and later rejected any anthropomorphic conception of the deity, he nonetheless held fast to this conception at an almost subconscious level. At the same time, however, he owed far more than he would ever acknowledge to positivism, in particular in its conception of a philosophical system as the unification of the various branches of scientific knowledge. He also followed positivism in his insistence that it was only possible to have genuine knowledge of phenomena, and hence that it was idle to speculate about the nature of the ultimate reality. The tension between positivism and his residual deism ran through the entire system of synthetic philosophy. Spencer followed Comte in aiming for the unification of scientific truth. It was in this sense that his philosophy aimed to be synthetic. Like Comte, he was committed to the universality of natural law, the idea that the laws of nature applied without exception to the organic realm as much as to the inorganic, and to the human mind as much as to the rest of creation. The first objective of the synthetic philosophy was thus to demonstrate that there were no exceptions to being able to discover scientific explanations, in the form of natural laws, of all the phenomena of the universe. Spencer's volumes on biology, psychology, and sociology were all intended to demonstrate the existence of natural laws in these specific disciplines. Even in his writings on ethics, he held that it was possible to discover laws of morality that had the status of laws of nature while still having normative content, a conception which can be traced to George Comte's Constitution of Man. The second objective of the synthetic philosophy was to show that these same laws led inexorably to progress, in contrast to Comte, who stressed only the unity of scientific method. Spencer sought the unification of scientific knowledge in the form of the reduction of all natural laws to one fundamental law, the law of evolution. In this respect, he followed the model laid down by the Edinburgh publisher Robert Chambers in his anonymous Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Although often dismissed as a lightweight forerunner of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, Chambers' book was in reality a program for the unification of science which aimed to show that Laplace's nebular hypothesis for the origin of the solar system and Lamarck's theory of species transformation were both instances of one magnificent generalization of progressive development. Chambers was associated with Chapman's salon, and his work served as the unacknowledged template for the synthetic philosophy. Evolution. Spencer first articulated his evolutionary perspective in his essay, Progress, Its Law and Cause, published in Chapman's Westminster Review in 1857, and which later formed the basis of the first principles of a new system of philosophy. In it he expounded a theory of evolution which combined insights from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's essay, The Theory of Life, itself derivative from Friedrich von Schelling's Nature philosophy, with a generalization of von Baer's law of embryological development. Spencer posited that all structures in the universe develop from a simple, undifferentiated homogeneity to a complex, differentiated heterogeneity, while being accompanied by a process of greater integration of the differentiated parts. This evolutionary process could be found at work, Spencer believed, throughout the cosmos. It was a universal law that was applying to the stars and the galaxies as much as to biological organisms, and to human social organization as much as to the human mind. It differed from other scientific laws only by its greater generality, and the laws of the special sciences could be shown to be illustrations of this principle. However, as Bertrand Russell stated in a letter to Beatrice Webb in 1923, this formulation has problems. I don't know whether it was ever made to realize the implications of the second law of thermodynamics. If so, he may well be upset. The law says that everything tends to uniformity and a dead level, diminishing heterogeneity. As an objection to evolution, this case is still regularly made by anti-evolutionists but does not apply to Darwinian approaches. It is is applicable to matter and energy, not complex social systems. Spencer's attempt to explain the evolution of complexity was radically different from that to be found in Darwin's Origin of Species, which was published 2 years later. Spencer is often, quite erroneously, believed to have merely appropriated and generalized Darwin's work on natural selection. But although after reading Darwin's work he coined the phrase "survival of the fittest" as his own term for Darwin's concept, and is often misrepresented as a thinker who merely applied the Darwinian theory to society, he only grudgingly incorporated natural selection into his pre-existing overall system. The primary mechanism of species transformation that he recognized was Lamarckian use inheritance, which posited that organs are developed or are diminished by use or disuse, and that the resulting changes may be transmitted to future generations. Spencer believed that this evolutionary mechanism was also necessary to explain higher evolution, especially the social development of humanity. Moreover, in contrast to Darwin, he held that evolution had a direction and an endpoint, the attainment of a final state of equilibrium. He tried to apply the theory of biological evolution to sociology. He proposed that society was the product of change from lower to higher forms, just as in the theory of biological evolution, the lowest forms of life are said to be evolving into higher forms. Spencer claimed that man's mind had evolved in the same way from the simple automatic responses of lower animals to the process of reasoning in the thinking man. Spencer believed in two kinds of knowledge: knowledge gained by the individual and knowledge gained by the race. Intuition, or knowledge learned unconsciously, was the inherited experience of the race. Spencer, in his book Principles of Biology, proposed a pangenesis theory that involved physiological units. These hypothetical hereditary units were similar to Darwin's gemmules. Sociology. Spencer read with excitement the original positivist sociology of Auguste Comte, a philosopher of science. Comte had proposed a theory of socio-cultural evolution that society progresses by a general law of 3 stages. Writing after various developments in biology, however, Spencer rejected what he regarded as the ideological aspects of Comte's positivism, attempting to reformulate social science in terms of his principle of evolution, which he applied to the biological, psychological and sociological aspects of the universe. Given the primacy with which Spencer placed on evolution in his work, Spencer's sociology might be described as socially Darwinistic. Despite the popularity of this view, such a description of Spencer's sociology is mistaken. While Spencer's political and ethical writings had themes consistent with social Darwinism, such themes are not present in Spencer's sociological works, which focus on building a theory regarding how processes of societal growth and differentiation lead to changing amounts of complexity amongst the various forms of social organization. The evolutionary progression from simple, undifferentiated homogeneity to complex, differentiated heterogeneity was exemplified, Spencer argued, by the development of society. He developed a theory of 2 types of society, the militant and the industrial, which corresponded to this evolutionary progression. Militant society, structured around relationships of hierarchy and obedience, was simple and undifferentiated. Industrial society, based on voluntary, contractually assumed social obligations, was complex and differentiated. Society, which Spencer conceptualized as a social organism, evolved from the simpler state to the more complex according to the universal law of evolution. Moreover, industrial society was the direct descendant of the ideal society developed in social statics. Although Spencer now equivocated over whether the evolution of society would result in anarchism or whether it pointed to a continued role for the state, albeit one reduced to the minimal functions of the enforcement of contracts and external defense. Though Spencer made some valuable contributions to early sociology, not least in his influence on structural functionalism, his attempt to introduce Lamarckian and Darwinian ideas into the realm of sociology was unsuccessful. It was considered by many, furthermore, to be actively dangerous. Hermeneuticians of the period, such as Wilhelm Dilthey, would pioneer the distinction between the natural sciences and human sciences. In the United States, the sociologist Lester Frank Ward, who would be elected as the first president of the American Sociological Association, launched a relentless attack on Spencer's theories of laissez-faire and political ethics. Although Ward admired much of Spencer's work, he believed that Spencer's prior political biases had distorted his thought and had led him astray. In the 1890s, Emil Durkheim established formal academic sociology with a firm emphasis on practical social research. By the turn of the 20th century, the first generation of German sociologists, most notably Max Weber, had presented methodological anti-positivism. However, it should be noted that Spencer's theories of laissez-faire, survival of the fittest and minimal human interference in the processes of natural law had an enduring and even increasing appeal in the social science fields of economics and political science, and one writer has recently made the case for Spencer's importance for a sociology that must learn to take energy in society seriously. Agnosticism. Spencer's reputation among the Victorians owed a great deal to his agnosticism. He rejected theology as representing the impiety of the pious. He was to gain much notoriety from his repudiation of traditional religion, and was frequently condemned by religious thinkers for allegedly advocating atheism and materialism. Nonetheless, unlike Thomas Henry Huxley, whose agnosticism was a militant creed directed at the unpardonable sin of faith, Spencer insisted that he was not concerned to undermine religion in the name of science, but to bring about a reconciliation of the two, starting either from religious belief or from science. Spencer argued, "We are ultimately driven to accept certain indispensable but literally inconceivable notions. Whether we are concerned with the creator of the substratum which underlies our experience of phenomena, we can frame no conception of it." Therefore, Spencer concluded, religion and science agree in the supreme truth that the human understanding is only capable of relative knowledge. This is the case since, owing to the inherent limitations of the human mind, it is only possible to obtain knowledge of phenomena, not of the reality underlying phenomena. Hence, both science and religion must come to recognize as the most certain of all facts that the power which the universe manifests to us is utterly inscrutable. He called this awareness of the unknowable, and he presented worship of the unknowable as capable of being a positive faith which could substitute for conventional religion. Indeed, he thought that the unknowable represented the ultimate stage in the evolution of religion, the final elimination of its last anthropomorphic vestiges.